Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the kickoff of our Women in STEM speaker series for the 2021-2022 academic year. My name is Tamara Pearson. I'm the director of the Center of Excellence for Minority Women in STEM here at Spelman College, and I'm excited to welcome all of you to our first event. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. We will have some time at the end for some questions and answers, so please feel free to use the chat for that as well. And I don't want to take up any more time from our speakers. So with that, I will turn it over to our two speakers who will be leading our wonderful event tonight. Thank you, everybody. I think you're muted.
All right, here we go. Good evening, everybody. My name is Arenih Kulkarni. I'm the CEO of CVP, a healthcare consulting and technology services firm supporting great work in the federal government. Over the past few years, CVP has been collaborating with Spelman College and other organizations to bring thought leaders and experts in their fields together with students and the public and faculty and alumni to spark discussion and reveal career opportunities in much needed impactful fields. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Marie Bernard, who will talk to us about the critical need for increased diversity in science to promote creativity and innovation. Dr. Bernard is the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, or COSWD. As COSWD, Dr. Bernard leads NIH thought leadership regarding scientific workforce diversity, ensuring the full range of talent has access to promote scientific creativity and innovation. She also co-leads NIH's newly announced Unite initiative to end structural racism. Prior to her selection as COSWD last year, Dr. Bernard was Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging, or NIA. As NIA's senior geriatrician, she serves as the principal advisor to the NIA director and led a broad range of activities, including co-chairing 2 Department of Health and Human Services Healthy People 2020-2030 objectives, that is, older adults and dementias, including Alzheimer's disease. She co-led the NIH-wide Inclusion Governance Committee that ensures appropriate inclusion of individuals in clinical studies, including by sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and inclusion of children and older adults. She also led the Women of Color Committee of the NIH-wide Working Group on Women in Biomedical Careers. Her national leadership in geriatrics research, teaching, and clinical practice has been recognized by the Clark Tibbetts Award from the Academy for Gerontology in Higher Education in 2013, and the Donald P. Kent Award from the Gerontological Society of America in 2014. Her work within NIH has been recognized with the NIH Directors Awards in 2018 and 2019, including the Directors Award for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in 2020. Till October 2008, Dr. Bernard was the endowed professor and founding chairman of the Donald W. Reynolds Department of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine, and the Associate Chief of Staff for Geriatrics and Extended Care at the Oklahoma City Veterans Affairs Medical Center. She has held numerous national leadership roles, including chair of the Department of Veteran Affairs National Research Advisory Committee, chair of the Clinical Medicine section of the Gerontological Society of America, board member of the American Geriatric Society, president of the Association for Gerontology in Higher Education, and president of the Association of Directors of Geriatric Academic Programs. She's lectured and published widely in her area of research, nutrition, and function in older adults, with a particular focus on underrepresented minority populations. She completed her undergraduate education at Bryn Mawr College and received her MD from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She trained at Temple University Hospital in internal medicine, where she also served as chief resident. She's received additional training, of course, through the Association of American Medical Colleges, the Health Services Research Institute, as well as the Geriatric Education Center of Pennsylvania, and the Wharton School Executive Development Program. If there is ever a role model for continued education to drive your career, I can't think of a better role model than Dr. Bernard. Please join me in welcoming her to the floor as she answers a very important question for all of us. What does diversity have to do with science? Dr. Bernard, over to you.
Thank you so much. As I listened to all of that, I was thinking that I've earned these gray hairs that you see here. I've been around the block, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk to the Spelman community. As you heard, I'm a graduate of another all-women's college, Bryn Mawr College, and I really am grateful to my education in that setting. I entered college planning to be a French major. I ended up graduating as a chemistry major and going on to medical school and doing the other things that were described. And it was because of that wonderful environment I was in. And kudos to Spelman. You were a top producer of women with PhDs in STEM, and that's really something to be proud of. What I will do in probably about 20 minutes or so is address three things that will hopefully then lead to our more general discussion. Whether diversity matters in science, and presuming that the answer is yes, I guess you can gather, I think the answer is yes. What can be done to foster diversity? And then very importantly, what are we at the National Institutes of Health doing? We are the largest funder of biomedical research in the country, probably the world. And so we have some responsibilities. So does diversity matter in science? Absolutely. As shown by this graphic, the problems that we're trying to address in biomedicine are like this elephant, maybe 50 times larger than this elephant. And we, the scientists who are trying to answer questions, are like those approaching it without sight. And thus you have to approach the questions from a lot of different directions, a lot of different perspectives to come close to getting an accurate answer. And we have objective data that demonstrates this. There's this wonderful study by Richard Freeman and Wong from 2015 that looked at some 2.5 million medical journal articles. And they developed what they called a homophily index, how homogeneous or how much the same the authors appeared to be in ethnicity based upon last name. Not a perfect tool, but used consistently. And they found that the higher the homophily index, the more alike the authors appeared to be, the lower the impact factor of the article. In other words, the less impact in science in general. Going all the way through to a low homophily index associated with 10 authors having a much higher impact factor. For those of you who are science focused, you are probably thinking that a paper that has 10 authors to it is probably looking at different science than a paper with 2 authors. But they looked at it not only in terms of homophily of the authors, but geographic diversity, how many different addresses are represented among the authors, information diversity, how many references are cited in the paper, and found that the more homogeneous, the more alike the authors appear to be, the lower the impact factor and the lower the citation percentile, the frequency with which the study was cited. So in other words, the more diverse the group, the greater the impact and the more frequently the article is likely to be cited. There's a lovely study by Haynes and colleagues in 2020 that showed another way of looking at diversity. It was looking at birdsong and an area of birdsong which was initially male dominated. And there was thought about the birdsong patterns that had developed in that field based upon studies primarily of male birds. But as women, as female scientists joined the ranks, they looked more broadly at male and female birds and found that there were differing patterns depending upon the sex of the bird, just again demonstrating the benefit of diversity. And then there was this really large study published last month in PNAS looking at some 5 million studies. And they looked at it from the standpoint of who published and what did they publish about. So this is white men, this is Black men, Latinx men, Asian men, Asian women, Latinx women, Black women, white women. It's called a heat map. The blue means there's very little publication in the area. Red means a lot of publication in the area. And you can see for the Latinas, Black women, white women, they tended to publish much more in health and psychology than in engineering, technology, mathematics, and physics. And it was almost the reverse for the white men, Black men, and Latino men. And there were fewer of the women who were publishing than the men, leading to the conclusion that there would be a different body of knowledge produced if there weren't these inequities, because women are looking at different things than the men are looking at. They make the value judgment that this body would be more closely reflect the spectrum of topics relevant to our society. And they suggest that resources for historically underfunded research areas should be provided. Again, many times the things that the women were looking at, and that there should be connection of scientists from underrepresented groups to high prestige networks and topics that makes a difference in terms of what gets published. We know that there's a lot of talent out there. This is representative of what's called R01 equivalent awardees, people who've gotten funding from NIH, an R01 grant. It's the brass ring. If you get one, you're guaranteed to get tenure, if tenure still exists at your institution, versus a representation in the general science, technology, engineering, and math workforce versus representation in the general US population. And looking at the data, whites and Asians appear to be well represented. Hispanics or Latinos and Blacks and African Americans, there's some room for further representation to take advantage of the full talent that's out there. And when you look at the professoriate, you see the same sort of thing demonstrated. At the instructor level, there are actually, on average, more women than men. This is underrepresented women, well-represented women, underrepresented men, well-represented men. But as you move up the ranks and you get to the point of department chair, there's a real imbalance there with women not as well represented as you would expect given the numbers at the instructor level. So there's a lot of opportunity. What can we do? We can do a number of things. We can look at things at an individual level. We can provide training programs. We can provide mentoring. We can train people about implicit bias to make sure that there are not unconscious things that are blocking people from advancing. Those are all necessary, but not sufficient. You also need to look at the institution and make sure that the institution is appropriately supportive to all. And that there aren't microaggressions going on or outright aggressions and other sorts of things that make it an unwelcoming environment for people who may come from varied backgrounds. How is this done? By being transparent and accountable, doing systematic reviews and being transparent about hiring and promotion procedures and policies, collecting and publicizing aggregate diversity metrics, providing tools to enhance recruitment and retention, and evaluating the impact of those sorts of interventions. And of course, linking this to institutional values and rewards, because if the institutional values are not aligned and the reward system is not aligned, none of these things will really work. So what are we at NIH doing? It's an exciting time. First of all, I exist as the COSWD, the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. In fact, this position was established back in 2014. Dr. Hannah Valentine from Stanford University was the first COSWD. As you heard from my introduction, I took on this role in October of 2020, first as the acting COSWD, and then being permanently named in the position in May of 2021. And the vision and mission for my group is to enable NIH and NIH-funded institutions to benefit from the full talent that's out there, because this fosters creativity and innovation. We do this by serving as the NIH thought leader in the science of scientific workforce diversity. There is a science to this. It's the science of changing behavior. It's the science of institutional culture change. And there's a lot of evidence out there to help us to catalyze cultures of inclusive excellence. So we are doing it through building the evidence, using NIH many times as a test bed for various interventions, disseminating the evidence through things like giving this talk. We have a scientific workforce diversity seminar series, which I'll talk about shortly. We have a blog. You can find that at diversity.nih.gov. We are interested in making outreach to the full spectrum of the scientific workforce, from trainees through to established tenured scientists. And we act on the evidence, looking at advancing integrated institution-wide systems to address bias, equity, mentoring, and work-life issues. And I'll give you some examples of that as well. And when we talk about diversity, we're thinking very broadly. We're thinking in terms of what's been defined as underrepresented populations in the US biomedical scientific fields, and as published by the National Institutes of Health in 2019, a special notice. So that includes individuals from racial and ethnic groups that have been shown by the National Science Foundation to be underrepresented in health-related sciences, individuals with disabilities, individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. There are multiple criteria that could delineate one as such, basically coming from a socioeconomically deprived background, women at the graduate level and beyond in scientific fields. As examples, there could potentially be others that should be listed there. So examples of some of the things we're doing, we have something called the Scientific Workforce Diversity Seminar Series that I mentioned. We have a session coming up next week. There's still time to sign up if you're interested. Looking at the science behind fostering what's called cohort recruitment, bringing in groups of individuals and giving them extra support, extra mentoring, being attentive to the environment to allow them to move through the ranks and be successful, particularly being successful in getting funding from NIH. It's 2.5 days. If you're interested in this sort of thing, please do, again, go to diversity.nih.gov to sign up. And in May, I'm particularly excited. This is going to close out our 2021-2022 season. We're going to have a session on does diversity impact science? I've given you some examples of that. Richard Freeman is the author of that 2.5 million article study that I cited. Dr. Smith, Dora, Kwan, Santangelo, or other experts in the area. Dr. Alondra Nelson is currently the Deputy Director of the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, will be stepping up as the Acting Director of that very shortly. She'll be giving opening remarks. Dr. Shirley Tillman is past president of Princeton University. She'll be giving closing remarks, and we've allowed adequate time for a robust Q&A following the presentation. So we're excited about that. And then we have something called the NIH Unite Initiative, which I co-lead with the NIH Principal Deputy Director and Deputy Director for Management. What is NIH Unite? It's an initiative to stop racism in the biomedical research setting. It came about by the events of 2020, where absolutely positively, everyone knows there was disparate morbidity, in other words, hospitalizations, other sorts of illness, and death as a result of the COVID pandemic, and the videotaped murder of George Floyd. We publicly unveiled this February 26th of 2021, and just a couple weeks later, it was the killing of 6 Asian women in Atlanta. All of this just putting into sharp relief the ongoing reality of racial and ethnic injustice in our country, and the need to do something about that. We at NIH felt that we could not be silent. So we started with a series of really intense discussions among leadership at NIH from following Memorial Day of 2020 on through the summer. We then launched internally in October this initiative called Unite, standing for Understanding Perspectives, New Research and Health Disparities Research, looking internally, being transparent and accountable, and looking externally. And we have a shared commitment that we must address structural racism in the biomedical research enterprise. One might say that's a bit audacious on our part, but we are the largest funder of biomedical research. So we have a little bit of influence, and we intend to use it. Another way of looking at this initiative is that we have health disparities research we're focusing on. We're looking at the external workforce and we're looking at the internal workforce. So I'll give you just really 50,000-foot highlights of some of the accomplishments. From the health disparities standpoint, we have committed approaching $60 million over the next 5 years to do transformative research to address health disparities and advance health equity. We announced 11 awards in October, 6 of them just generally addressing this topic, 5 of them addressing this topic at minority serving institutions. And there's an additional competition this fiscal year for more awards to focus at minority serving institutions. Looking internally, recognizing that we need to have our own house in order before we ask the external world to address their issues. We now have, remembering that you have to align rewards and incentives, a performance metric for leaders at NIH. We have 27 institutes and centers. Every single one of those institute and center directors has for their fiscal year 22 performance expectations, leading change, paying attention to business, but particularly when it comes to leading people, focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This is something that's come from the Department of Health and Human Services. We're a component of it, but we, NIH, are overachievers. We have 4 domains of expectation here, as opposed to the 2 HHS has given us. And one of them is that every institute and center at NIH is going to develop a racial and ethnic equity plan for staff. As a component of this metric, they'll be developing it and submitting it by April 1. It'll get reviewed and approved by leadership, and then they'll begin implementing it starting May 1 with the expectation that this will be reviewed at least on an annual basis and updated based upon changing circumstances and things that are learned. And then looking externally, there's a lot that's going on in this area. And again, I'll say this is a 50,000-foot view of things. One of the things is that we have, for the first time, a funding opportunity announcement. That's what FOA stands for, a solicitation for people to apply for grants for us that includes language that one must have a plan to enhance diverse perspectives as a consideration for scoring. Heretofore, people would do a grant review, and they'd review the grant, and then they would separately consider, if it's a human study, whether the population that's going to be included in the study is appropriately diverse. So the score, and then it's a yes, no. What's happening here is, as part of the scoring, which drives whether or not it gets funded, it'll be considered, the reviewers are asked to consider, do they have adequate plans to include diverse perspectives in developing the science? And diversity here is defined very broadly: diversity of discipline, geography, as well as the things in our notice of special interest. But this is the first time this is precedent setting for NIH to be able to consider this as part of the scoring. And we're very excited. There's this opportunity. It's being included in many other funding opportunity announcements going forward. And we think it's going to contribute to more diversification and bringing more of those differing viewpoints that are necessary for creativity. We also have something called the FIRST initiative, Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustainable Transformation, that is doing the cohort recruitment thing that we're having the seminar about. This was the brainchild of the COSWD office. The intent here is to create cultures of inclusive excellence. So academic and research institutions across the country are getting the opportunity to compete for funds to bring in groups of faculty, to provide multi-level mentoring, professional development, to pay attention to what's going on within their own institution, to make sure it's an appropriate climate that doesn't have bias, that there are things that are equitable, that there's mentoring, that there's a good balance of work-life issues. And in the initial solicitation, we also we're looking for a coordination and evaluation center. We are committed to providing up to $241 million over the next 9 years for this initiative. And the first set of cohorts was announced in October. There is a collaborative between Tuskegee, University of Alabama, and Birmingham. There are high resource institutions, low resource institutions, and an opportunity for 2 more rounds of cohorts. So the fiscal year 22 rounds, the applications are in and being reviewed. There'll be an announcement soon of a competition for fiscal year 23. And at the end of this, we'll have at least 14 cohorts across the country, probably about 120 or more faculty who are moving up the ranks, who will be largely diverse. And Morehouse School of Medicine won the competition to be the coordination and evaluation center. As I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you'd like to see more and understand more, I really refer you to the Unite website. We have an icon that will take you to the milestones in progress. Just Google NIH Unite, it'll take you directly there. I'm going to close with a couple of feel-good stories, at least from my viewpoint. Dr. Crystal Hill is a early career researcher who I first met when I was deputy director at the National Institute on Aging. She came to our technical assistance workshop in 2010. She then participated in what we call the Butler Williams Scholars Program in 2015, an intensive 1-week exposure to aging research and leaders in aging research. The next year, she got what's called a diversity supplement from NIH. This is extra money to add on to an established researcher's project to do their own project. She then got a training grant from the Diabetes Institute, joined their network of minority health researchers, came for another training on the NIH campus called the Future Research Leaders Conference. And just last year, she got a Mosaic grant, as we call it, a K99 R00. The K99 is training, the R00 is that R01 grant, that brass ring that's necessary for one to get tenure if that's available at your institution. So very proud of Crystal. It looks like it's been a long journey, but this is the way it works in biomedicine. And then another example is Dr. Cosmica Corbett, who I understand has spoken for this series. Dr. Corbett has benefited from the pathways that are made open as a result of NIH funding. This is a picture of her with Dr. Francis Collins, the NIH director, who stepped down just in December. And Dr. Corbett started off high school, college, graduate school with NIH funded programs. She became a postdoctoral fellow at NIH. And as a postdoctoral fellow at NIH was the lead of a group that made very fundamental discoveries for the development of mRNA vaccines that have been pivotal for treatment of COVID-19. She, as this past summer, has moved on to Harvard in an endowed professorship. But another great example of the fact that one can be very successful with persistence and NIH help. So I will close with our favorite adage: great minds think differently. This is what we're all about, and I'd be really happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, that was really remarkable, Dr. Bernard. And if we were all together, I don't know if we can do this virtually, but really we need to join together in a round of applause for the presentation. And it was just fantastic. I was just mesmerized by the amount. I mean, we do work at the NIH, but I had no idea, how well the NIH is sort of working together to basically promote diversity in all that it's doing on the workforce side, cohort side. It's just a fascinating story and a great inspiration, I'm sure, to all the students and alumni that are with us today. I'll get started with some of the questions because I know it takes the audience a little bit of time to get warmed up. So I do have one. You started off by, on the personal side, you talked a little bit about your background, and you said, look, I was initially thinking I was going to major in French, and I think everybody really would enjoy hearing what got you pivoted from language, which is great, to ultimately a career in medicine and then ultimately in research.
Yes, it is a funny story. So Bryn Mawr College, I get there. I was going to be a French major. I was going to be an interpreter at the UN. I grew up in Oklahoma. I'd never been to France, but I'd taken a lot of French classes. But when I got there, there were women who'd been to France 3, 4, 5 times, and my Oklahoma accent did not cut it. But we all had to take a science in that freshman year, and I took chemistry, did well. I took more, did well, and discovered there's a love for that there. And one of the beauties of it being an all women's college is the women were all kind of starting at the same stage, at least back then, in science. My daughter, who ended up going to a non-women's school, found that the science classes with some of the men in them were not necessarily as egalitarian. So I found out I did well. I got some exposures in the summer, fostered by my dean there at Bryn Mawr, that helped me to realize that bench research, although nice, was not really what I wanted. I wanted the people contact. So I went to medical school because of great counseling and support from family, from Bryn Mawr, and I really credit the fact that I went to an all-women's school to allow me to discover that aspect of me.
Wow, no, that's very, very interesting. I have two adult girls who, as a father, you sort of want everyone to enjoy all of the opportunities that are available to them, but you can tell sometimes there's sort of gender-based differentiation that occurs even in school. I'm talking about elementary and middle, and it almost finds a way of separating people into sort of we self-select our careers somewhat depending on what coaching we're getting in those early years. You haven't talked much about your school years in Oklahoma. What was that like growing up in Oklahoma when you did? Was there, obviously educational opportunities were probably somewhat limited. I'm assuming, I don't know your background from that perspective. The kindling of interest to even think that I want to go to the UN as a French interpreter. How did that happen? What was your environment like growing up in Oklahoma?
I'm a very privileged person. Both my parents were physicians, and they were physicians back in the day when there was not the guaranteed pay that physicians currently get. But I did better than most. Didn't make it to Europe, so I didn't have the mastery of French, but they were very, very supportive and very thoughtful about what the future should be, and didn't pressure me for anything. So I was went to the Catholic high school and took all the classes one's supposed to take and did really well, and went to this lovely college. I will tell you that my mother grew up in New York, and she was the one who said to me, okay, you can go to college in Boston, New York, or Philadelphia because we have relatives there. And you have to apply early decision because we're not going to deal with it. And so that's what I did. And that's how I ended up at Bryn Mawr College. It was a wonderful choice. So I was very supported. I did not have my science identity formed while I was in middle school or junior high school or high school, as is often the case for young people. As I said, it was when I got to college that I realized that's something I wanted to do. But the reality of the matter is, yes, the data suggests that science identity is often developed as early as middle school. And some of the differential treatment that young girls may get versus young boys can send them in a different direction and not let them take advantage of their talents.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much. You talked a little bit in your talk about how important it is, even you talked about the cohort initiatives and how important ensuring diversity in the cohort for your research and I guess the question is, how does diversity of the scientific workforce translate into diversity of participants in scientific studies?
So as I was chatting with my colleague, who's the director of the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities here at NIH, we have to acknowledge the data aren't as robust as we would like, but the data suggest that if you have the data are pretty strong that if you have diverse staff who are making outreach for recruitment into clinical studies, that you're going to have a more robust group of participants. The data are less strong that when you have a diverse group of scientists, it makes for a difference. But you have anecdotal things like I just left the National Institute on Aging in May of 2021. So my life has been aging research. We did a lot of Alzheimer's research, and it still kind of bothers me, quite honestly, that we have our first new drug for Alzheimer's that was approved last spring, first time in more than a decade. And when you look at who was involved in the study to lead to the approval, it is 89% non-Hispanic whites, 9% Asians, and only 2% others. And yet when you look at the data as to the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease, is highly prevalent in African Americans, highly prevalent in Hispanic Latinos. And I would put forward that if you had a more diverse group of scientists who were designing the studies and looking at the outreach, that they would have been perhaps sensitive to that. We have other data that shows that there are differences in the way that Alzheimer's may express itself by population. And there's no question that race is a social construct. It's a proxy for SES and environmental exposures and all sorts of other things. But you see things like that, and that was not an NIH funded study, I can say that. But you see things like that, and you recognize that there could be real value to having more diversity there. My colleague Eve Higginbotham, who's an ophthalmologist and does research on eye diseases, gives the great example of glaucoma medications. Glaucoma is highly prevalent among African American populations. And the clinical researchers who are coming up with some really effective drops to help with glaucoma were finding that there was much less compliance with the recommended with the intervention that was being tested among the African Americans than among other populations, and they really didn't understand it. But as they had African American scientists to join the group, the scientists would point out, well, those drops leave people with red eyes, and that is not considered necessarily acceptable in the community. It suggests that you are, perhaps hungover or on drugs or something like that. So it made them go back to the drawing board and think a little bit more about side effects of the medications that they were giving and what might be more impactful. So a couple of anecdotal examples, but
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Just to carry on that topic, you also talked a little bit, you had some wonderful role models that you shared with the students and the faculty of young African-American researchers that have really driven their careers, supported by NIH, of course, and have really grown and now are in the position where they can contribute back very important discoveries in science. It is probably also true, and I don't have data to support this, but my sense is that Black African-American scientists are probably a little bit of are they at a disadvantage with regards to grant applications at NIH? Is that true, not true? If it is true, what is NIH doing about that?
That is an excellent question. The whole reason that this Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity position was developed was because in 2011, Donna Ginter and colleagues, including Bernard Kington, past principal deputy of NIH, happens to be an African-American male, did an analysis of success at getting the R01 grant, brass ring, by race ethnicity. It was published in 2011 as the period 2000 to 2006, I believe. And they found initially that if you're African-American Black, if you're Hispanic Latino, if you're Asian, that you were at a disadvantage as compared to non-Hispanic whites. However, when they controlled for multiple other confounding factors, things like English as a first language, where you trained, where you're working, et cetera, those disadvantages went away largely for all groups except for African Americans. No matter how many different ways they looked at it, African Americans and Blacks were about 10 points disadvantaged as compared to non-Hispanic whites. So Dr. Collins, the NIH director, turned to his advisory committee and said, what should we do about this? And one of the recommendations was to establish a role where the person is paying attention 24/7 to these issues and making recommendations for changes. And I'm really happy to say that between the COSWD position, between investments NIH has made in new programs, between everyone really being focused, it looks like we're making progress. There's still more progress to be made. In particular, there aren't enough scientists who identify as African American, Black, Hispanic, Latino, as compared to the general population. And we really need more. So those of you who are Spelman undergrads and thinking about pursuing a career as a scientific researcher, please think about it seriously. You can contribute quite a bit, and we need more.
I just picking up on that, you made a terrific comment. I mean, you started off, I'm sure, when you were thinking about French versus, chemistry and then ultimately medicine, diversity and inclusion and equity as a concept, I'm sure was always in the background in terms of, things that were important, but you've really honed in on this. You just talked about the new role at NIH, the COSWD. From your perspective, how did this become a bigger part of who you are? How did you end up focusing on this the way you have more recently in your career?
Well, I think because, again, I earned the gray hair. So I was often early in my career, the only woman, only person of color. And, I was the twofer many times, was brought into things and paid my minority tax. But I also, because I saw that, felt within myself a true obligation to others to make sure that there are other people like me around. So it's always been part of what I do. When I was the department chair in Oklahoma and got the opportunity to build this department, University of Oklahoma College of Medicine has a pretty homogeneous looking student population in keeping with the demographics of the state. It's a state institution. And I was accused of having established the United Nations because I didn't recruited so many different people from different places and different backgrounds. But number one, they were the best people. They had the best knowledge base to bring to the department. And I thought it was important for the students to see that to be a successful physician, researcher, teacher, you come in all sorts of packages. As I came to NIH as the deputy at NIA, one of the things I said to Richard Hodis, the director, is I'm really interested in that pathway forward for others, and I really want to focus on that sort of thing. So there was a lot of opportunity to do other things like chairing the Women of Color Committee, like co-chairing the Inclusion Governance Committee. So it's just been part of the DNA, part of my fabric, and thus, when Francis Collins called me in August of 2020, first thing I thought, oh, what did I do wrong? The NIH director doesn't call you all the time. And then I thought, maybe Hannah's getting ready to leave, because Hannah had been kind of making noises like that. And sure enough, he was asking me to be the acting COSWD. And I was thinking, I guess I do have the track record that would make him think to ask me. And as I got into the position as the acting, I said, wow, this is bringing together all these past experiences. This is really neat. There's this Unite initiative I'm co-leading. There's the COSWD, the wind and the stars and the moon, everything's aligned. So it's just a wonderful time to be able to do this and to take advantage of all those past experiences. So, clearly it was not a plan. It's just opportunities have come along that have been just wonderful.
And then just walk through that door. I do want to encourage our audience to start posting questions in the chat. I do see one that's come up, and for the benefit of everybody, I'll just read it out. And so this is from Lisa Brown. The question is, even in high school, smart girls in STEM can be viewed, unfortunately, negatively, especially by peers. Does it get better for girls, in your opinion, in college today? I mean, Spelman has a unique situation where it's all female, but that's not true everywhere. Is there more support as you start thinking about, young women coming up in school and beyond? Is there more support for girls to finish and stay the STEM course? I'll just add to that. I do a lot of work with my alma mater, GW, in this particular area around minority female engineering students. Of course, GW is a co-ed education, but educational institution, but we do monitor in our quarterly board meetings the percentage of women of color who are graduating, not just starting. And there is a tail off. There is, we watch the statistics of incoming freshmen who have elected some STEM discipline as their major, and then compare that to graduating rates. And unfortunately, there's a fall off that starts somewhere in the sophomore year. And what can we do? What are your thoughts on that topic? I think it's a very important question.
Yeah. So what you're describing that you're seeing there is representative of the data nationwide. You start off at the high school level with a lot of young people interested in the sciences. They come into college with that interest. It goes down over the course of time. They get into graduate school. The number who finish graduate school goes down. They go into postdoctoral training. The number who stay goes down. So progressively there's loss. And part of it is barriers that people have to face, personal barriers, particularly trainees from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups may have more in the way of financial challenges. They may have more in the way of family responsibilities. They may have come from an educational background that was not as strong as that of their colleagues and see some barriers there, even though that doesn't mean they're not smart. Or they may be in a college setting, for instance, that has the old-fashioned approach. Let's winnow them out and get the best here. And that's not necessarily taking advantage of the talent that's there. There are studies that demonstrate that when you have a college approach that is more focused on trying to bring out the best of all, as opposed to winnowing out, that when you look at the end of the 3 or 4 years, you see those people who came in not as well prepared doing just as well, if not better, than those who were well prepared, are good at taking tests. I think one of the things that I see is just based upon pure numbers, there's more support. People can look around and see more people like themselves around. There are progressively more programs to try to help with things, but clearly we still have more work to do when you look at the numbers.
We have a few more questions here. Karen Pete, how can individuals become aware of their own bias? What are some questions you would suggest to individuals to consider?
Their own bias, is that what the question was?
We are all victims of our experiences. We all bring our, without meaning to be biased, we sometimes have hidden bias that comes out. There are probably techniques and ways to self-test to drive better awareness. Any suggestions, any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, we thought a lot about the issue of implicit bias. And in fact, we have a online training program that has been mandatory for all NIH staff. And if you're interested, it's free. It's on our website at diversity.nih.gov. So that's one thing that one could potentially do, is just go through a training to help make oneself aware. That's necessary, but not sufficient to address issues. And another step one can take is, yes, being consciously aware that this is potentially an issue, and asking colleagues to help you, to make you aware when your behavior is not in keeping with your goal of being fair and equitable to all. Sometimes 360-degree evaluations can bring that sort of thing out. And there are lots of implicit bias testing approaches that are available online. But I would simply say that being aware of potential unconscious bias is absolutely necessary, but you also need to have a plan in place for mitigating it.
Thank you. Dr. Pearson has a question. At Spelman, we have many students who want to be physicians. How can they influence the future of diversity in scientific research as a physician?
I think physicians have a really, really important role with this. Even if you don't want to be a researcher, and there are physician researchers are kind of dying breed in science, unfortunately. It takes so long to get your MD, maybe get an MD and a PhD, go through training in research, and then getting your grants when one can potentially, as a physician, start making money more rapidly. That, you know, the numbers of physician researchers, they haven't actually truly gone down, but proportionate to PhD only researchers, they're just not there. And the sorts of questions that physician researchers ask, I would posit, are different than the sorts of questions that a non-physician researcher might ask. So I'd again encourage you to think about it. It's a needed area, and particularly if you're a physician researcher who's come from an underrepresented background, you're going to bring to that experience something different than your colleagues, and that's really important and valuable. But if that's not the route that one wants to take, there's another role that physicians are really, really important for, and that's helping your patients to recognize the value of volunteering for clinical trials. In my role as the co-chair of the Inclusion Governance Committee, what we could see in terms of the data is that the people who volunteered for clinical studies tended to be non-Hispanic whites. And you had to really work hard to make outreach to African Americans, Hispanic, Latinos. I think Asians were a little bit better, but Native Americans, Alaska Natives, they were virtually non-existent in clinical studies. So having a physician, however, who says to the patient, you ought to think about participating in this clinical trial, can be pivotal in the patient choosing to participate. So there's an important role that you have there if you don't want to be the physician researcher, or you can be collaborating with a group of researchers. So there are a lot of opportunities.
You know, I know Andrea Norris is not here with us from NIH, but if she were, I think she would make a plug for the All of Us program that NIH has. So if the folks on the call are not familiar with that, that is NIH's goal to obtain genomic and other related information from over 1 million members of the United States, citizens, so that it can become a real great research trove. And again, I fear, people who might be contributing to that cohort might be skewed population-wise, and we need it to be well represented. So I'll just, on her behalf and on NIH's behalf, I'll make that comment. It's the All of Us program. You should be able to Google it and find out how to support it. I think we have a very, very interesting personal question. I hope you don't mind it being asked. Have you yourself ever experienced any forms of rejection or underestimation as a woman of color pursuing a career in medicine? And if so, what techniques and what approaches did you use to overcome those hardships and those feelings of rejection, perhaps?
Oh my goodness, where should I start? Particularly when I was very early in my career, didn't have any gray hair. I'd walk into a patient's room and they'd think I was the nurse. I'd answer the phone, they'd think I was the nurse. So I always answer the phone, this is Dr. Bernard. I had an experience when I was a second-year resident in charge of the emergency room at night, and I happened to have a student working with me who was an African-American male, and we walk in to see the patient in their exam room, and they say, I don't want to see you, you're Black. And I had the pleasure of saying, well, if you don't see me, there's no one to see you because I'm the one who's in charge, So those things have happened, but it's like, you have to be like the duck, you let it roll off your back and you focus in and you do what you need to do. As you get further along in your career and people know you, you tend not to run into those sorts of things overtly. You know that there may be things that are going on, below the surface, but you have to focus and just get your work done.
Yeah, I'm sure, a lot of us have had those experiences. And I think your advice of, at some point you just sort of keep your head, keep focused on the objective and let some of this stuff roll off is probably, while we are institutionally working to make everything a more equitable and inclusive environment. some of these things take time, and we should never lose hope. And it's the power of your example, I think, that ultimately drives that success. We have 5 minutes. I suppose we have time for one last question before we close and move to the next piece. I think Tanya Wilson, I hope I'm saying that right. Question, I know you mentioned that the NIH is making sure that they do things to improve diversity in-house before they ask other institutions externally to do so. But in your opinion, what do other institutions need to start implementing if they do not today have diversity-focused departments or research taking place? What's your advice there?
So, yeah, and I misspoke with regards to that. We are taking care of our own internal work, but we're also looking externally. And over the course of the next year or so, there will be a number of funding opportunity announcements released that will help to align values again. You put somebody out there, people go for it, just as we've seen with the first initiative. My office has recently released an opportunity for researchers to get extra money on their currently funded grants to recognize excellence in mentoring in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've had an overwhelming response. It's not that much money we're offering, but people will go for the money. And I think that to be prepared for the things that will be coming from NIH, we had an advisory committee to the director meeting December 10th, and we said we're looking to do things like maybe offer grant awards for excellence in mentoring, or maybe prizes for excellence in mentoring, or maybe opportunities to allow institutions to do self-studies of their climate to see what sorts of improvements can be made. So for those who are interested in getting a jump start on those things, first of all, look at the video of the advisory committee to the director meeting from December 10th of 2021. And then, look at what's available in your environment and what you can begin doing to prepare for these things, because there will be opportunities to get NIH funding to support those sorts of things.
I'll just make a comment here. You have at least one person on the call who is a participant in the Baltimore longitudinal study. So Sharon wishes you well and applauds your efforts at the NIH.
And thank you for your service. It's such an important study.
It really is, yeah. We have probably a few more questions than we probably have time. I'll take moderator's privilege and just ask one important and final question, which is, if you wanted everybody on the call today to leave with one core message, one core idea or something that they can take back tonight, what might that be?
I think the core message would be to recognize that great ideas come from all over, regardless of who's making the suggestion or what they look like or what they do, and to be open to that, because that will allow you to have better outcomes in whatever it is that you're trying to achieve.
That's well said, and great advice. I will, at this point, we're a minute ahead of time, but I think I have to say, it's just been such a remarkable presentation, Dr. Bernard. I want to just extend my personal gratitude for participating I have learned a tremendous amount today, and I'll turn it over to, please everybody join me in a round of applause, virtual again, but thank you so much, Dr. Bernard. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Pearson. I believe she's got some housekeeping and sort of a next agenda in mind, and I'll turn it over to you, and I will take your leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernard. Thank you so much, Anirudh. This was just an amazing conversation this evening, so thought-provoking, so educational. And so I just want to once again thank both of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be a part of the Spelman community. As was said, there's just a couple of things I've shared in the chat, a link to give some feedback on tonight's event. We always like to hear from our audience to learn about what you thought of, what you experienced, and any ideas that you have for how we can improve. And then also to just give a plug, you'll be receiving this through email as well, but we do have our next event scheduled. It will be on March 22nd. It'll be a fireside chat with Dr. Marquesa Black of Procter & Gamble and one of our wonderful Spelman students, Taylor Beverly, who's a chemistry major, and they'll be talking about the future of cosmetic science and the importance of diversity in the cosmetic science industry. So please stay on the lookout for that event. And with that, I will say good night to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.